Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of dtalks. And I would like to welcome you once again after a brief break for the festive season. And uh, we continue on this journey to understand how foundational literacy and numeracy can be achieved on a large scale. And this is something which the National Education Policy had given foremost priority. This is something which SDG 4.1 and 4.6 has given foremost priority as well. And we are constantly trying to understand that during and post the COVID crisis, uh, still trying to recover and plan a short term, medium term, and long term recovery that to the education that has been really badly impacted because of the pandemic. And one organization which has been leading from the very forefront in the area of enhancing education, and also has contributed majorly to academic research on education, and especially on foundational literacy and numeracy, is the Azim Premji University and Azim Premji Foundation, who, as we are very well aware of, the work spans across the country. And today we have a very special representative from the Azim Premji Foundation. He is the Chief Communications Officer and Managing Editor of the Azim Premji Foundation. He serves in the Board of Management of the Azim Premji University as well, and he was earlier its Chief People Officer for the university as well. And prior to joining Azim Premji Foundation, the speaker today has worked with several corporate giants in the corporate sector as well. Our speaker for today has also been a regional president of the National HRD Network and has been on its national board for several years as well. And he has also co-edited the journal on education, employability, and employment. So we are very honored to have Mr. Sudheesh Venkatesh ji, who will be sharing his idea of disruption and his ideas of change with respect to foundational learning and education, and what have been some of the learnings from the Azim Premji schools during COVID-19. Sudheesh ji, an absolute honor to have you here on dtalks, and we really look forward to your presentation and having a discussion after that.
Ashok, thank you very much for this generous introduction. I hope I'm both audible and visible. It's been pouring heavily here in Bangalore, so I hope the network holds up. There are no power interruptions, so fingers crossed. Let's get started. Yeah.
Yes.
So the idea for today's session was, of course, you have been doing several sessions on foundational learning and education. But if I could bring forth the experience of Azim Premji Foundation, experience with our own schools, experience in the government schools that we work with, and some findings from the research that our organization has done. So I thought if I could share that with your audience, it could be useful and generate an interesting conversation post my presentation. So there are three key points which I wish to cover today. The first is, this whole myth of online learning. So how good is online learning? How penetrative has it been? How much of learning levels have been compromised because of it or have been furthered because of it? So we can talk a bit about the myths of online learning. We can talk a bit about learning loss that has happened in students. And I'm largely referring to the kind of students who come to our schools and the kind of schools that we work with, which is largely the disadvantaged sections of the country. not the urban upper middle class English medium students. I'm talking more of the disadvantaged sections of the country. And thirdly, as children come back to schools, with schools reopening, um, what can we do as school system and teachers to recover the lost learning? So if there has been a depletion of foundational abilities in numeracy and maths, numeracy and language, then what should be done in the curriculum and in the pedagogy so that students recover the lost learning fast? So three parts. One is the myth of online education, and two, the extent of the loss of learning, and three is how to recover the lost learning. So that's pretty much what I hope to cover in today's session. So if you could go to slide 2, Mashud. Right. So if you quickly pass your eyes over what this slide is saying, this is what I said in summary in my opening remarks. What's also possibly going to be useful is that I will talk a bit about our own experience in one of the schools which we run. This is the Bamor school in Tonk district of Rajasthan. So what have we learned from there is something that I would talk a bit more in detail. So a lot of what I'm going to say is rooted in our own experience, and it may not be the experience of some other institutions, of some other organizations, but what I'm going to share is our experience. Next slide, please. All right. So this first point is, why should one focus on foundational learning? I think many of us are aware of the theory behind it, but let's just look at a few of those aspects. Firstly, the country already has a compromised education system, right? We have not been adequately engaged in the crucial learning years of our primary students. Year after year, the ASER survey and similar such surveys, the National Achievement Surveys and many others, do point towards, compromised learning of students, particularly in the primary sections. Now, this happens because there is limited infrastructure, and also partly because of the capacities of our teaching staff, right? And this becomes even more true in the most vulnerable communities. So in the most deprived sections of society, where the schools lack in infrastructure, and the posting of teachers, the teacher-student ratio, etc., are all compromised. Obviously, learning levels take a hit. So there is a problem across the country, but more so with the disadvantaged sections. Now, COVID brought on more challenges on top of an already compromised system. It disrupted the learning of students. It caused dropouts, and it caused erasure of the learnings. So learning levels of children sharply dipped because there was no access to schools. Not for a short period of time, but for a good 18, 19 months of time, Despite all the good efforts that many people did, the fact is that students' learning got compromised. Now, what is foundational literacy? Right? Uh, Basically, we are saying the ability to read with comprehension, right? Read and understand. For instance, in class 1 and 2 in primary schools, uh, we are talking about, can you identify letters? Can you read familiar words? And if a paragraph or a sentence is narrated, can you listen and understand? The ability to sort of retain this learning comes next. So, foundational learning followed by the ability to retain that learning. Why is that ability to retain that learning important? It's important because it the future learning depends on understanding of these foundational aspects. So, what you study in upper primary and secondary education is built on the understanding of primary. So, if there is a compromise in the learning levels at primary level, it gets amplified into poor learning levels at the upper primary and secondary levels. This is true in language and even more true in maths. Therefore, teachers should have appropriate resources to be able to impart this literacy and numeracy skills to students. So, teachers should know where each student stands and specifically what kind of abilities need to be built, rebuilt, so that the student is back on the learning track. This is what foundational literacy and numeracy means in the context that we are in, right? Let's move on. Next slide, please. Now, in this context, what did COVID-19 do? Right? What happened during COVID? A study that we did, which has been widely published now, that shows that prolonged closure of schools now for over 18 months has had a significant impact on the learning levels of children. Right? This is not a small study. It was undertaken in 5 states, 26 districts, 1,522 schools, one teacher from each of those schools, so 1,522 teachers, and also parents, 398 parents. So it's a fairly large sample in which this study was conducted. And the total number of students in that universe of the 5 states and 1,522 schools that we touched was about 80,000 students. So it's a very large representative sample on which we have based what we are saying, right? This is not new. This has been published, widely quoted, and I'm just repeating it here because it sets the context for the next few slides. So teachers are telling us, and these are not small number, right? 80% of these teachers are telling us that they find online education inadequate and ineffective. So when we ask them why is it inadequate? Why is it ineffective? They are telling us that, look, it's impossible to maintain emotional connect with children. The online medium is impersonal. It doesn't allow you the interactivity that is required to build that emotional connect, to assess where the child stands and to know what the child requires. The online medium is limited. There is also no meaningful assessment of the child's learning. When you are in a classroom, you know whether the child is comprehending or not. You ask a couple of questions, you look at the responses, you in in the eyes of the child you can see whether the child has learnt or not. So therefore, teachers are telling us that they find online education inadequate and ineffective. Parents have also echoed this sentiment. When we talk to parents, and that's not a small number either, right? Parents, slightly smaller percentage, 70% of the parents that we talked to said that, online learning is not effective for them. And we should bear in mind, once again, that all that I'm saying is rooted in the context of our schools and the government schools that we work with, right? Which is the disadvantaged sections of society, right? Now, more than 60% of the students, more than 60% of the 80,000 students that our universe touched, our sample touched, so to say, more than 60% of those students do not have access to online education opportunities. So there is a very big issue of children not even being able to log in to classes, even if online education would have helped them, right? And lastly, the study also told us, and this is counter to the popular narrative, the study also told us that almost 90% of the parents were willing to send their children back to schools if there were adequate health safeguards. So, if the school is able to assure adequate health safeguards, then 90% of the parents were willing to send their children to schools and wanted the schools to reopen. In urban India, in the English press, one often sees that, parents are unwilling to send children, etc., etc. There could be truth in that. But in the sample that we touched, this is what we discovered. Next slide, please. So that should tell us a little bit about the myth of online learning, right? Let me go on to the next aspect, which is what has been the loss of learning during the pandemic. To what extent have student learning, to what extent has student learning got compromised, right? So, forgetting a concept, forgetting a method, forgetting some aspects of what has been learned, let's call it regression. Okay, so regression in learning, supposing that's the phrase, that's the term we use. So what was learned earlier, which has now been lost. If we look at this across primary classes, right? And if I take language first, the learning loss in language is, this is humongous. 92% of the children on an average have lost at least one specific language ability from the previous year, right? So if you take grade specific learning levels, there is something the child would have learned in class 2, but when the child has moved to class 3, 92% of the children have lost one of those abilities, language abilities that they had when they were in class 2. Let me give an example, right? So you give the child a picture and ask the child to describe the picture, right? That's a language ability. Here is a bird. It's sitting on a tree. When it chirps, it makes this kind of noise. Supposing that's the kind of description of a picture that a child can do, that ability is got reduced. These are some of the language abilities. So we are saying that at least one of these abilities is lost. Reading, reading familiar words in their language. So if you take Kannada, Ata, Patha, whatever, right? Some words that have been given, familiar words to them. That's also now many children have lost. Further, reading with comprehension. So reading something and then understanding what it means, and writing simple sentences based on a picture, right? These are language abilities. And in this set of abilities, at least one of those abilities has been lost in 92% of the children. That's what we are saying. Now let's go to maths, right? Because the whole discussion is around foundational literacy and numeracy. If I go to maths, uh, 82% of children, this is also very large, but a little lesser than in the case of language. 82% of children, on an average, have also lost one specific mathematical ability. So in primary classes, what are we talking about? We're talking about, abilities like identifying single and two-digit numbers, performing basic arithmetic operations, 1 plus 1 equal to 2, and maybe a little bit about solving problems, right? In the slightly higher classes in primary. Now, if this is the set of foundational mathematical abilities, one of these has been compromised in 82% of the children, right? So the learning loss, both in language and maths, is both massive and real. So what have we said so far? We have said that online learning is both inadequate and ineffective. And we have said that COVID has caused a situation where foundational language and mathematical abilities in children have got hit quite badly. Next slide, please. Right. So that said, um, let me now talk a bit about what can be done. Okay. And we'll go a little deeper on each of those, right? When we say focus on foundational learning, and the first point is on the digital divide, let's go a little deeper into each of them, right? Now, there has always been an issue of equity in the country. The opportunities for good education are not uniform for children, we know that. But the shutting down of schools and the decision to shift from traditional classrooms to digital platforms, which was tried initially, actually increased the inequality even more. It increased the inequality at a systemic level. Entire sections and geographies got excluded, or within classes, some children would have it, many children would not have it. And therefore, this whole issue of inequality got exacerbated during this period. We saw that 60% of our students had no digital access to digital tools. So things that are assumed, right? A smartphone, a power backup, internet, the money to recharge if the thing has run out. So if you take any of this, 60% of our students did not actually have access to digital tools. And this was even more so, meaning if we take the real rural India and some of those places where we are, in fact, even deeper in terms of the rural areas that we serve, this issue was even more stark there. So therefore, what we are saying is uh, digital learning is not viable for all students, and new ways need to be adapted to ensure that there is competency in learning. So, what is this adaptive learning, right? So, I'm going to the second uh, point there on the slide. So, we have to find new ways of teaching and learning, right? If digital doesn't give you the access, then how do we ensure that our students don't forget what they have learned, right? So, if they have to keep pace with the basic curricular expectations that we have, then how do we do that, right? So, for instance, can we do a mixed learning, hybrid? So, some digital, some offline, so that the foundational subjects, whoever is able to access digitally, maybe they are a little more privileged, but those who are offline still don't lose out entirely. So, how do we do that, right? Now, so we tried, and many governments actually ran this. There was the uh, Vidyagama program in Karnataka, Mohalla classes, which were tried in some places, I think Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh. So, how do we take the school to the children, right? And when you do that, there are challenges. Uh, in a school, not everywhere, but in many schools, you are able to segment the children based on their uh, grade and class, whatever, and then you have a, uh, a a classroom with a particular cohort of students, right? But here, when you take the school to the mohalla, when you take the school to the doorstep of the student, uh, you have to virtually be prepared for a multi-level, multi-grade class, right? So, how do you teach? What kind of worksheets do you give? What kind of stories and curriculum will you adopt when this is the reality, right? Those were the challenges that naturally came to us, and it was not a simple scenario by any stretch of imagination. So let's see what we did and what we have discovered. Next slide, please. Right. So I will now talk about our Bamor School of Tonk district in Rajasthan. And those of you who know this, Tonk is in the southeastern part of Jaipur, uh, uh, one of the backward districts of the country. We have been there, we have been working there for possibly 12 years now, and our school has been operational for possibly about 7-8 years, right? We have 247 students in that school in grades 1 to 8, and whatever I'm going to share is based on our experience with such students in this school, right? So, to ensure this continuity of learning for our students, we tried a few things, right? And we were also learning as we were going along. So, the first thing we did naturally was online, right? The moment this happened, we tried to switch online. So, we tried to see, whether we could teach over smartphones, we could do video calls, and whether we could share and correct assignments over WhatsApp, right? But very quickly we realized that, look, the resources just didn't exist. I mean, it was exclusionary. It was causing the exclusion of several students, and it was inadequate. So we had to move to phase two quickly, where we told our teachers, and by that time, the wave one had started to recede, and with adequate precautions, with appropriate masking and social distancing and all that, our teachers started going out to the community with worksheets, specially designed worksheets, which would work for multiple levels of students, right? Largely self-learning. The student takes the worksheet, and through the process of solving the problems, solving the issues, questions, whatever, there is self-learning that happens. So there was a lot of thought that had to go into the design of these worksheets. Normally, worksheets are used for assessment, right? And it is based on a textbook chapter. So supposing, you know, some basic aspects of, let's say, singular and plural in language I'm taking, or past tense and present tense and future tense or something, is there. There is a chapter, and after that, there is a worksheet which sort of helps you understand it. These worksheets were both content and the exercises, right? And unfortunately, this was also about having to do it with very minimal guidance, right? Because unlike a class in a school where the students are there for, let's say, 6 hours in a day, that was not the case here. I mean, you go to the community, you are in the mohalla, you are assembling a bunch of students, that too from different grades. What you have is a couple of hours. That's all, because the structure is not designed for long hours of teaching there. So with minimal guidance, how do we ensure that students do self-learning, which means the worksheets had to be designed with a lot of thought. This also meant that we had to collaborate with parents, right? I mean, the communities had to be supportive. I mean, what's the point if you go there and if the communities are unwilling to send the children there, right? And that fear of COVID was quite stark in the minds of people at that time. But very, very quickly, because of the credibility of our teachers, because of the persuasion that our teachers did, and the social distancing and masking and other norms that were diligently followed, the parents started to develop confidence that, look, they should send their children. So the class may happen in the presence of a temple or a dargah, or it might happen under a tree, it might happen on a tank bed. All these are real, right? So it happened. And instead of a situation where there was zero learning, at least there could be some learning, right? And the parents themselves contributed to conducting the classes. There are things that they could share from their experience. Some of them were educated themselves. They had greater credibility in the community, so they would also chip in with their teaching. Equally, they took it upon themselves to teach at home a lot more than they would normally do. So, from what could have been a complete washout, we were at least able to get it to some level, if not the full level. The teachers also had to be equipped. The teachers, for them also, this was a new scenario, right? So the teachers had to be equipped with the new way of teaching, and they had also got apprehensions of going out there. I mean, the scare of the infection was running high on everybody's mind. And also, how will this new system work? Teachers are used to students coming to school. They are not used to going out to the community and teaching there. So this was done. And so through a combination of worksheets, WhatsApp, and such multiple modes, engaging the community and some of our alumni, the slightly older students, we were able to make some dent in education there, right? Next slide, please. Um, if I go a little deeper into, how do you do a multi-level, multi-grade class? Can you say a little more? Supposing some one of you asked me that question. Yes, um, in states like Karnataka, the Nalikali program has in many ways uh, tried to crack this problem. Right now, the situation brought upon us had forced us into an MGML situation, multi-grade, multi-level situation. Right. So what we would do is we would begin with a common topic which was both new and relevant to everyone. So the teacher would go there and, let's say, pick up a topic like water, right? So today we are going to discuss water, so that all students could participate in the dialogue. And when you talk about water, you could talk about the uses of water. You could talk about the composition, the chemical composition of water. You could talk about the crisis that has come about in water, etc., etc. So this was not a standard class. A topic is being taken and the students are getting engaged in the topic, and each one was taking as much as their comprehension and abilities allowed them to. So you create a dialogue, you facilitate that dialogue, and through that you impart knowledge where different people, different students are picking up whatever they are able to pick up, right? And then the assignments would follow. And those were differentiated based on levels. So the teacher would make an assessment of at what level of understanding is the student, and give them, uh, if the student is at a slightly more advanced level, give them a slightly more complex worksheet. If the student is at a basic level, give them a simpler worksheet, right? So that was how the multi-level, multi-grade class issue was addressed. Partially, yeah, I'm not at all claiming that we had uh, resounding success, or we could do everything that we could do in a school. Not at all. um, the other thing is, we didn't teach to the textbook. That was virtually impossible in this kind of a situation. uh, we broadened that learning to be either thematic, like what I said. Water was an example I took. It could be, wheel or fire or whatever, right? Some theme. uh, but equally, we also took library books there, right? We would take a storybook, nothing to do with the textbook. So you would take a storybook, or you would take an atlas, go to the class, go to the community, and engage the students on the story from multiple angles, right? Somebody would read the story, somebody would try and read the story for the students. Somebody would pick out the nuances in the language or in the grammar. Somebody would take the illustrations in the story and then talk about it. So instead of teaching to the textbook, we largely used other resources, typically the library kind of resources, uh, for learning. So this is, in one sense, not very conventional kind of learning. This was what I would believe true learning. In fact, in schools, one often finds that there is something called a library class, right? I mean, in the week, there is a slot that is earmarked for library. Here, it was the other way around, where every class was actually based on the library. So, uh, our teachers would carry these books in a jola. Some people called it the jola library. You take books at multiple levels. Some may be uh, very basic, some may be a little more advanced, some may be a little more complex. You take all that, give it to the students, encourage a discussion, and then collect it back or leave it with the students. Next day, you go with a new set of books, take these back. So the teachers really experimented uh, to ensure that students still were on the learning curve. Now, this was also a time when our teachers were told that, look, you should encourage open-ended thinking, right? It's not about right answers, wrong answers. Uh, it This is not the time when you can do all of that. This is the time when you should allow students to think expansively and build on their thinking, uh, contribute to the discussion, nudge the child on the path to more learning, etc., etc. Right? Of course, I talked about the better community connect. Uh, what it did, interestingly, is the better community connect, going out to the community, meeting the parents, persuading them to come to send their children to the classes. The effect of that was the attendance in class improved. Equally, because the parents got involved in teaching, the students' learning also improved. Right? So there is a great benefit that we realized through the community connect that our teachers had. And one last thing, and then we can go to the last slide and close. Um, See, the language we find is not something which is only in a language class. So even if you are teaching environmental science, the subject of environmental science provides you a platform to explore the nuances of language, right? And equally, language plays a very important role in being able to appreciate mathematics or environmental science. I'm just taking the uh, primary school subjects, right? So, language is not just for itself, but language has a bearing on other subjects as well. That came home even more strongly to us in this exercise. The last slide, please. So, what's the road ahead? Uh, all of this is known, and you must have heard this in earlier seminars as well. We need to have wholehearted investment on quality primary education. That's why that foundational learning is so important. The NEP, like Mashood said at the start, uh, places significant emphasis on this aspect. Um, what does foundational learning mean? What kind of approaches should be adopted? How do we encourage communities to also have a stake in it? That's a big learning from this whole 18-month period, and I think that's also something that can be used going forward. It's a very positive outcome of what has happened. Um, I think it has also forced our system, teachers, to think outside the box. Here, it is outside the class on how to engage students in learning. It's not just mainstream schooling which happens inside the class, but there are ways in which you can promote learning outside the class. And, perhaps this whole experience has also made the system more resilient. God forbid if there is a crisis of a similar nature later, and I'm also already hearing, for example, because of the pollution scenario, the air quality scenario in Delhi, schools are getting closed. Uh, if such, I mean, we don't know what kinds of situations will emerge, and if mainstream schooling becomes a challenge, then the learning that we have had in the past 18 months can form a basis for our plans for the future on how do we fortify ourselves against crisis of this kind? So, with that, let me pause and uh, I've taken 45 minutes to cover off what our experience has have been. And Mashood, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sudheesh ji, for this very comprehensive take on foundational literacy and numeracy, and I think some of the experiences you have shared, and even the research which you have cited from the Azim Premji Foundation and University, it is something which has really created a lot of tremors across India's education community to the extent and the gravity of the crisis of learning that we have. And of course, you have covered you've made some very important points in your presentation about not just taking us through, conceptually. You've really helped demystify what we understand or what we want to strive for when we talk about foundational literacy and numeracy. We've shared these examples about how the community has a very important role in ensuring that our children are learning. You've talked about the different challenges which classrooms face with respect to multi-level classrooms and multi-grade classrooms, and that's something which has been even more aggravated because of the crisis. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We wanted to ask you some questions, and we'll just start with the very last point which you made about resilience. And the COVID, of course, has it has shown us that this is this is a crisis of great proportions, but this might not be the last crisis. What could be some of the lessons that we have learned from this COVID crisis, which will help us may ensure that our children and especially teachers are able to ensure resilience in the system and the continuity of education? If you would like to share your thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah. I touched upon some of them as we went through the slides, but let me try and uh, pick a few, aggregate them, and try and share a few things which could answer this question, right? So, when the crisis happened, it was virtually like deer in headlights, right? We didn't know which way to go. The instinctive reaction of the system and uh, even some of us was to switch online, right? And only to realize very quickly that that won't work. So when we say resilience, the first thing we should realize is uh, what appears, what is apparent as a very quick fix solution is not really something that works. So therefore, the systems have to be built to be able to cope with this, right? So, for example, you know, uh, our teachers need to be equipped and trained to be able to go out there to the community, engage with students of real India, understand what they need, how they learn, and invest their time in taking education where the student is, right? I think that whole capacity building in the system is one aspect of that resilience. um, I also think that you know this whole thing has fostered innovation in many ways, right? Learning need not be confined to the textbook. Learning can be across a broad array of learning material. uh, the moment you look at it that way, learning can happen anytime, anywhere. Every opportunity for an interaction is a learning, right? Can we think innovatively? What I have called out of the class mode. So we should be prepared. So teachers being capacitated to deal with adversity of this kind, out of the class mode kind of innovative thinking uh, is the second. And the third is, let's also see if we can supplement all this with some digital penetration. So, can I'm sure it's already happening because of market forces, but can that be accelerated? If you are hit with a situation like this, then we are talking about a hybrid mode only that will be effective. And that is a combination of online and offline. The first two solutions that I spoke of were relating to offline. But at the same time, can we make online more accessible, penetration improved, costs dropping, better infrastructure, all of that, right? So, education should not be a casualty because of a crisis of this kind, because what the country has lost in the last 18 months is just humongous. Yeah, back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Sudheesh, for sharing your thoughts. And the Azim Premji Foundation report on the learning losses. The sample which was taken was from government schools, and the magnitude of the losses are extremely worrying. And what is now interesting to see is that, I mean, just yesterday the ASER report was released, and it has shown that the enrollment of the proportion of children enrolled in government schools has actually kind of increased by almost 6 percentage points since 2018. So we are seeing a lot of like the what in the past decade had been happening with more children moving out of government schools towards private. At a national level, there seem to be more increase in government school education enrollments. What do you feel this means for foundational literacy and numeracy in government schools? How do you think government schools can prepare for this? And what do you see is the role of institutions such as Azim Premji Foundation and other foundations that work on large scale government school improvement?
Right. So, one of the uh, sad trends that we were seeing in the country was the exodus of students away from government schools to private schools till 2018, right? Uh, this charm of a English medium school, uh, sometimes even the exterior aspects of a uniform, shiny shoe, uh, a teacher being there at school who would, give homework. These kinds of things caused a kind of a misplaced attraction uh, away from government schools to private schools. And there was a trend across the country. And we used to lament the trend. And but COVID has, like you rightly observed, has turned the tables. The question, though, is we don't know as yet if it is a definite turn which will last. I mean, is it a irreversible trend now? That we don't know. But clearly, the enrollment in government schools has increased. 6% is the number that you shared. It's possibly around that. And why has that happened? If we look at it, I think, teachers, I'm sorry, the parents, the economics of their household has got hit, right? I mean, some people have lost jobs. Many people for a long period of time, had very diminished incomes. So the government school is free education. And the very fact that here was a government school which would offer free education, whereas the private school was expensive, the economics of it hit the parents very hard, and that realization dawned on them. I think that's one. The second thing is, many private schools are shut. See, the moment this COVID happened, and they could not run classes, and therefore they could not charge fees, and therefore they could not pay teachers, etc., etc. It was a chain reaction. Many schools virtually wound up. So there is no private school out there. In many parts of the country, the access to private schools may have reduced, which has brought students to government school. So there are possibly many reasons for what is happening, but whether this is an irreversible trend, that time alone will tell. But in one sense, we are happy that we are seeing this, because we have always said that the infrastructure in government schools is often better. The teacher in the government school has cleared a teacher eligibility test, is well qualified, and very often, person to person, better in capacities. So we are happy that this is happening, but is it definitive? Time alone will tell.
Um, Thank you, Sudheesh, for your thoughts. In conclusion, we would also like to take one question from the audience. So there's a question which one of our audience members has shared. Has there been a long-term impact on the teachers you motivated to teach in this vastly alternative way with multiple ages and without textbooks? And is did academic results of children improve? If this has been published in a paper. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it has certainly helped teachers understand that there is a new way by which they could teach and engage with children. That there is no doubt. The uh, Every adversity, uh, there is an opportunity, right? And never waste a crisis, they say. So therefore, this, in some sense, I think the teachers have learned some new things because of the crisis. But has it increased their motivation levels? Will they be able to teach better now in the regular classes? Will this lead to improved learning outcomes? Too early to say. Um, so we have not done any study on that as yet. It's very early days. Um, if there is something that we find out, we will be the first ones to come and share it with you.
Yes, sir, absolutely, and we would love to have you again on this forum to share this continuously amazing work which Azim Premji Foundation and University are leading. Sudheesh ji, it's truly been an honor to have you here on the Disruptive Talks. The ideas that you have shared, which the foundation, Azim Premji Foundation, has been leading with its research, with its very innovative pedagogies, and really how it really the reports also have really kind of informed the like kind of pioneered a lot of conversation around the learning losses as well, and how this is something which will actually need to be addressed on a mission mode, the crisis of foundation learning. And we do hope that with the new Nipun Bharat mission also, that to achieve this universal FLN and in a targeted mission manner, we do hope that this is something which has now political acceptability, and at the topmost political level there is a will to deal with this. So we again would like to thank you, Sudheesh ji, for joining us here on the Disruptive Talks and sharing your idea of disruptive transformational change.
Right. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Mashood, Shefali, and team. Sunita, I really hope this met your expectations, and I thank the audience and wish you all a nice evening.
Thank you.